many podcasts today actually record and then pass the recording on to other people via the internet.
Yes.
Yeah, that's the fashion in podcasts now.
I mean, the unrecorded podcast has a long and noble tradition, doesn't it? It's Shakespeare's famous podcast Cardenio, for example.
Yeah, many people these days are actually, just meeting in person and podcasting to each other, vocally.
Yes, so hello listeners, we are Cinema Eclectica, part of the Geek Show podcast network. We are the Geek Show's dedicated movie podcast. I'm Graham, and I've been joined this week by...
Tim!
It's good that, because normally we all trip over each other talking at the same time when we do that, but this time, I think we nailed it.
Yeah. Well, it helps, of course, that actually it's just me doing a really very good impression of you for your bits.
Yes. Yeah, that's what this podcast is, listeners. It's a ventriloquism podcast.
Yeah, not really the essential quality of ventriloquism captured in sound only, to be honest.
But it's lowered the bar nicely.
Yes.
Later on in the show, we'll be having a review from Mick of the classic silent film Der Golem. And we've also got... What are you doing again, Tim?
I'm going to be reviewing the Polish film Werewolf.
Nice. But before that, we have our film of the week, and we had a bit of trouble deciding what would be our film of the week. Last week, it depended on, what everyone could get to see, what the local cinemas are showing, and the local cinemas really helped us out there by being useless.
Yeah.
So instead, we decided to run an impromptu director's lottery, which came out with the Hungarian director Ildiko Enyedi, who we have covered on this show before.
Yeah, I believe she previously, her previous film before the one we're about to cover was My 20th Century, which was, as I dimly recall, as being completely bananas and about anarchists throwing bombs and things.
Yes, yeah, it's a film about early 20th century anarchism, the Edison Company, and the suffragette movement, which has a scene narrated by a family of chimps.
Oh, yes, that's right, yeah. And yet, nevertheless, it sort of made perfect sense.
Yeah. And her most recent one, too, I did a while back, On Body and Soul, which, listeners, if you haven't seen On Body and Soul, it is almost certainly one of the greatest films of this decade, and you should definitely get on that.
Wow, okay. Well, I'll be seeking that out.
So we decided instead to watch one of the ones that kind of fell between those two films. We watched Magic Hunter from 1994. And yeah, this is just about as rich a stew of ideas as the other ones, really, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we'd ended up doing a... Because he's a Hungarian director, of course, we ended up doing a sort of slightly impromptu Eastern European special this week, haven't we, really?
We have, yeah. I mean, even Mick's German film is about Czech folklore.
Yeah, but Magic Hunter, or is it Magic Hunter? Someone who hunts magic or who hunts using magic?
That is genuinely ambiguous, isn't it?
Yeah, I guess most of our listeners won't be familiar. This essentially, it's a sort of magic realist kind of thriller drama that follows more or less the experiences of a police marksman who inadvertently kind of shoots, when trying to shoot a terrorist, accidentally shoots a hostage.
Yeah.
And as a way of kind of atoning for this, or perhaps in the foolishness of his attempts to atone for it, ends up making a sort of strange magical pact where he's given some magic bullets.
Magic bullets, yes, which never miss their target.
Yeah, the conceit being that supposedly you get 7 magic bullets and the first 6 of them never miss their target, but the 7th one, the target is chosen by the devil. So it will always it'll hit the target that the devil chooses, which obviously sounds like it'd be bad news for you.
Yes, but it comes with a free Frogurt.
Yes. And if any viewers who get that reference can write in at the end to achieve nothing.
Yes.
Why do I say viewers? It's listeners. Well, any viewers, I suppose, as well, who were just looking at their headphones. Yeah. But this narrative of the policeman making a kind of Faustian pact doesn't really describe Magic Hunter terribly well, because there's a lot else going on in it. There's the fact that he gets assigned the mission of being a bodyguard for a wandering chess grandmaster.
Yes, yeah, one of those town-to-town chess grandmasters that you hear so much about.
With the complication that he also gets involved. I don't know if you could exactly say a love triangle between him, his wife, and the chess master.
I think that's it's fair.
Very faint suggestion of that. But also the fact the chess grandmaster is not supposed to know that he is guarding him. So he's sort of weirdly got the chess guy as a target whom he's not supposed to kill.
Yeah.
It's a very peculiar situation with a kind of unspecified terrorist threat.
So
it's got the kind of trappings of a sort of police thriller, or some of them. But none of which really seems to describe the movie, because it also has a subplot set in medieval Europe.
Yes, this is what I was going to talk about, listeners. If you thought this sounded a bit too straightforward so far, there are Vikings and quite a lot of stuff about the Christianization of Europe in here.
Yeah, there's proper elements of like medieval magic taking place as well, and some elements that look quite a lot like Monty Python and the Holy Grail.
I was hoping you were going to mention that. There is, in fact, literally a scene where one of the Vikings farts in someone's general direction.
Yeah. So, effectively, a lot of the events that are happening in the present day kind of have parallel events sort of happening in history. Do they double up some of the actors?
I think they do. I'm not entirely sure. We watched, listeners, you should know that we watched a not great copy of this that seems to have been taken from a VHS. And if there is one take-home lesson from this week's Eclectica so far, it would be someone please do a Blu-ray.
Yeah, because the version I managed to find is... You see, the movie has a bit of kind of nationality mix-up as well, because it seems to have been made possibly originally in English with English actors.
Yes.
Well, British actors.
Yeah, because Max, the police marksman, is played by Gary Kemp, who is probably most famous for being in Spandau Ballet, but at that time had an acting career that was taking off due to his role in the 1990 film The Craze. It also had Sadie Frost just after she'd appeared in a memorable role in Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula. So it's got a bit of international muscle behind it, but our copy was nevertheless mostly in Hungarian.
Yeah, so we watched a version that would have had some English dialogue, except it had been dubbed in Hungarian and re-subtitled into English.
The quick way round.
Except for some bits that were dialogue in German, which hadn't been subtitled into English.
Yeah, that annoyed me. Again, Blu-ray now.
Yes. Not just Blu-ray, but we want a Blu-ray with tons of extras to at least provide more theories about what on earth is going on here.
I think there is a general sense of... What's that theory that Alan Moore quotes in From Hell? The architecture of history?
I don't know. What is that theory that Alan Moore quotes
essentially
from Hell? What is the architecture of history?
It was a Victorian theory that if you could look at history as something other than linear, you would spot other patterns and repetitions through it that we ignore because we experience it forwards.
Oh, that's quite okay. That's an interesting idea, and yeah, there's certainly a lot of that in Magic Hunter, which does kind of tangle up the timeline a bit. Not that heavily, except insofar as it kind of interweaves the medieval subplot, or the medieval kind of side of the story. But also, it begins with a kind of narration that then tells a story in flashback, and it twitches in and out of that a couple of times. It's effectively it starts with some of the characters and some other characters holed up in a bunker trying to survive the bombing.
Yeah. And there is this astonishing edit after that where it goes to what seems to be archive footage of World War II, and then cuts to archive footage of like lava, as though it's literally flashed back to the beginning of time, which is just an astonishing leap, and the sort of thing that I think is all over Enyedi's work and makes her so exciting.
Yeah, and the funny thing is, I mean, for sort of, it seemed to receive, when it first came out, this quite mixed reviews in some ways, at least not kind of wholly positive. And some people to my amazement, criticising it on the grounds that it kind of overuses sort of montage of just imagery, and that it's quite abstract in some cases. The film is full of, just sort of imagery of animals and nature is quite a common one. So there's rabbits going in and out of burrows, the kind of snails crawling across things, and there's the one that I particularly like was the sort of flocks of sheep sort of going over hillsides and that kind of thing, and sort of flowing around the place. And it obviously seems to be drawing some quite non-specific parallels between the way the animals behave and the way the humans behave. So part of the kind of medieval magic that's on display is that the devil, or a kind of what you call a faun, I suppose, like a satyr sort of character with horns and hooves, has helped a lot of medieval peasants build a bridge, with the condition that the first person who crosses the bridge, their soul will belong to the devil. And so they effectively, to solve this problem, because the devil is there insisting someone crosses the bridge and nobody is willing to be the first person to do it, they managed to persuade a snail to cross the bridge very, very slowly. And so the devil gets a snail's soul rather than a human.
Yes, which is, it's one of those sort of flavours of traditional mythology and storytelling that never gets used in films, doesn't it? That kind of silly, tricksterish quality to it, that you never see that reflected in movies about mythology, and I was really happy to see it in here.
Yeah, and I found it completely charming. And there's another act, which is there's a kind of icon of the Virgin Mary, a sort of painting. Yeah. And at one point, there's a rabbit fleeing from a pack of dogs. And essentially, the painting kind of comes to life, and the rabbit sort of enters the painting and then is just converted into part of the painting. So the painting now shows the Virgin Mary with a rabbit at her feet.
Yeah.
And that's how the rabbit escapes, by kind of becoming part of the image. And so the dogs can't catch it.
Which is brilliant. And I had to check that Virgin Mary was not Sadie Frost, because it does look a lot like her.
I mean, the upshot of this kind of, all this sort of montage of kind of natural experiences and animals, and also of the fact there's this medieval subplot, is that in a way the film is quite a kind of short story, really. It doesn't kind of have much of what you'd call any kind of epic quality to it. More or less, it's that the experience is what happens to Max, this marksman, who gets hold of these magic bullets.
Yeah.
And I mean, it pretty much had quite a sort of Chekhov's gun angle, almost literally at the start, which is the character quite early on in the movie is given 7 magic bullets, and it's like, well, the first 6 of them will serve you perfectly, and the 7th one obviously is going to bring about a disaster. The 7th one is the power of the devil.
Yeah.
And you sort of think, well, that gives a pretty neat structure to the movie, doesn't it? Which is that obviously he's going to fire 7 bullets throughout the course of the movie, and the last one's going to go disastrously wrong. But to tell you the truth, it didn't kind of stick as closely to that as a sort of structure for it as I expected. He kind of uses a few of them, and then it sort of just proceeds to the kind of expected crisis and ending.
Yeah.
So the plot doesn't kind of advance all that much. In a way, he spends most of the movie kind of watching this chess master guy, kind of following him around, and scenes of what the guy gets up to that are, in a way, quite kind of uneventful. And this seems to have been a criticism that some viewers had at the time, of saying, well, not a lot happens in it, in a way. It kind of sets up the scenario at the start, and then it just sort of inevitably ends it.
But when you compare...
I don't know. I mean, I'm only reacting to that and saying I didn't think that bothered me at all.
No. I think when you compare something like this to a lot of mainstream movies that are based on folk stories, on mythology or fairy stories, I like the fact that it uses all of these weird subplots and digressions to keep the main story short and to the point, because fairy tales and myths have a lovely kind of simplicity to them. And it bothers me a great deal when you see some big Disney movie that tries to lard them out with supporting characters and, B-plots and psychological motivation and other things that Charles Perrault absolutely did not want.
Yeah, and it must be said, with the number of magic bullets, if it's 7 magic bullets, you can be pretty sure that bullets number 3, 4, and 5 are probably going to be irrelevant, really.
Yeah.
You could sort of say, in terms of the 3-act structure, you only need 3 magic bullets for that.
Yes.
But like you said, that there's also an aspect of saying, well, these kind of folk stories are told from a deliberately kind of naive, slightly childish perspective, and that's quite a kind of explicit angle in Magic Hunter, which is that the main character's kid is part of the story. And sort of slightly inspects and sort of overhears parts of it, like finding that one of the bullets in the dad's pocket and that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think
being sort of curious.
it has this kind of intertextuality too, which I would love to dig into further. I mean, there are these wonderful shots of the rabbit that you mentioned just bounding in and out of tunnels with the camera snaking behind it, and it's hard not to think of Lewis Carroll at this point. I have learned that the central story of Max the Sniper is a modern dress version of Carl Maria von Weber's opera Der Freischütz, about which I know nothing.
Yeah. Except that I think that some of the characters are shown actually watching that during the film.
Oh, right.
Aren't they?
No,
I think
that, it's quite possible.
There's a scene where the theatre is evacuated due to the bombing, possibly.
Right,
and it was kind of unclear when that happens. But I think the thing they were watching was that opera.
Right. Yes, I did remember thinking that a lot of the music sounded unlike a film score, so it's quite possible it comes from there. But listeners, what I know about opera could fill a large book about opera, of which several have been written, and I haven't read them because I know nothing about opera.
Wow, that's a complicated way of saying it. Okay, fine. Yeah, I know nothing about opera as well, so we'll leave that opera comparison to, I presume, the podcast Opera Eclectica.
Yes,
which exists presumably.
But it does.
Our counterparts there.
Yes, part of the Geek Show podcast network, of course. It does indicate that there is a deep web of referencing here that I feel, frankly, a bit unqualified to get to grips with, but it is there, and I'm looking forward to seeing it again and seeing if I can get any further into it.
It has another quality which it has, which I like, is the kind of wider story of the setting in the world.
Mm.
You get really no interest in it at all. It's like, well, he's shooting this terrorist at the start of the movie, but you never really find out what that was about exactly. It deals completely with his reaction to it.
Yeah.
And likewise, he's protecting this mysterious man in the white suit, the chess champion, without really, the guy's under threat from completely sort of unidentified assassins. In fact, they don't even know that he is particularly under threat. He was part of a group of people who were shot at.
Yeah.
And apparently he hangs around with lots of bigwigs, but it's never said who they are. And all this... the chess master is a pretty kind of, in a way, pretty heavy-handed symbolic character, which is he sort of goes around in a white suit and he plays as the white side in chess against a lot of different opponents. So it's kind of, it's not hard to interpret that as some sort of, force of good or good versus evil that's taking place.
Yeah, yeah.
It was reminding me a bit of Bergman,
Oh, yeah.
Ingmar Bergman's The Seventh Seal.
Yes, yeah, that's good.
Which obviously has a lot of, has a medieval setting, and obviously games of chess quite significantly in it.
And also the other thing about The Seventh Seal is that while it is a masterpiece as history, it is complete bunk. It has no veracity as a piece of medieval history whatsoever. So it is quite a good comparison with this, in that it will sacrifice detail in order to give it that feeling of a fable, of something that's been told so often that people have kind of forgotten the literal truth of it and who was going to shoot who.
Do we want to kind of give away the ending? I think it's been 20 years and we can discuss the ending.
Yeah, I think that's doable. Listeners, if you do not want to hear it, just skip forward about 10 minutes, I guess.
Yeah. Only to say that it ends more or less with a kind of act of divine intervention.
Yeah.
Sort of, which is that he reaches the point of crisis, which is that obviously he needs to fire his gun and he's got the devil's bullet left. And he fires at this target of this assassin who is supposedly coming to kill the chess master. And more or less what happens is the Virgin Mary, who's been kind of appearing in the medieval bit, manifests and sprints to stop him. So you get a moment of extremely slow, bullet time, where the bullet is flying through the air, and then the Virgin Mary dashes into the way and snatches it out of the air with her hand, and that's pretty much the end of the film, isn't it? Near enough.
It is a bit like Wonder Woman, except with the Virgin Mary instead of Wonder Woman.
Yeah. It has splendidly, she kind of is in the proper sort of medieval sort of nun's robes kind of costume, but she goes probably sprinting through the streets of the city in order to get to the place where the shootout is happening. And you could say, well, in a way, is that a Deus Ex Machina ending near enough, which is just that, effectively a mystical power prevents
I'd say it's
the disaster.
perfectly
But again, it's
well
not
set up deus. It's a deus ex
exactly,
machina where you were allowed to see the machina and its internal workings.
Yeah, and the whole movie is part of the machine, really. So yeah. Yes, I don't think it. I mean, it's not something that bothered me at all, given the kind of general tone of it and how many strange goings on there are. So,
one minor point that we haven't mentioned: executive producer David Bowie.
David Bowie. I mean, in what context does that make sense? I mean, how does that come about exactly, and what did he do?
This is so fearsomely obscure that even Nicholas Pegg's The Complete David Bowie, a tome which devotes, if memory serves, 6 pages to the first Tin Machine album, does not contain a mention of Magic Hunter.
So, I don't know. We'll just have to, just kind of try to imagine what role David Bowie actually had exactly, and who knows? Some mysterious X factor was injected, which, if you watch the movie, in a way, will not puzzle you really.
Yeah. Well, what happened is that she was looking for funding, and then suddenly David Bowie appeared dressed as the Virgin Mary, chased through the streets, and gave her a check. Yeah, that's it. So,
how do we summarize it? I mean, I don't know if you've already got the idea, really. If you like this sort of movie that is, in a way, an entirely modern, almost a kind of the outline of a police thriller plot, but told completely through a kind of magic realist kind of fairy tale folklore sort of logic, then if that sounds like it appeals to you, you'll probably love it.
I can't imagine what people drawn to the cinema by, Gary Kemp and Sadie Frost might have made for it, but I would give it a cautious recommend. I would love to see it in a print where I find it a bit more visible and the German dialogue is subtitled. Yeah. But the least you can say of it is that it is every bit the sort of mad cocktail of ideas that my 20th Century and On Body and Soul have.
I mean, if you try to look for an overall moral in it, I mean, I guess there were several ways of interpreting it. You could kind of expect that it's going to take the path of a sort of Faustian pact, where he's in order to regain his honor as a sniper, having accidentally shot someone other than the target, he effectively signs up with the devil in the form of an arms dealer and gets these magic bullets. And it's like, well, was the ending just going to be his kind of hubris, where obviously it was going to lead to disaster? But it just doesn't go in that straightforward a way, really. There's lots of other stuff going on.
Yeah, here. I suppose it's very pro-snail, isn't it? That could be a moral.
Oh, it's quite strongly pro-snail. Yeah, it has just lots of other curious little things. I mean, I rather like that he. Let me think. When he's practicing with the magic bullets, I think he fires 3 of them just to test them. And he shoots a photograph of his intended protectee, and it more or less gets to the point where he tosses a coin in the air and just fires the gun in the air, and of course the bullet goes exactly through the middle of the coin, so it just hits whatever he wants it to hit. And he fires across the city skyline, aiming for the hands of the clock, and it hits the hands of the clock and smashes the clock at a distance of 1.5 miles or whatever. Which, come to think of it, is part of the reference of time having got scrambled, probably, isn't it?
Yeah. There is this kind of coherence under it, no matter how wayward it seems, I think.
Yeah, but it's got the quality which I guess you could even say crops up in Hitchcock now and again, of not really caring that much about what the kind of outer motive for the story is, the sort of unspecified MacGuffin. Or the kind of, sort of thinking like spies and murderers whose motives you never really find out exactly. They're just there to make the story happen. Yeah.
So do we have any recommendations to go alongside this, other than, as I say, Enyedi's other films that I've seen, which I think are absolutely spellbinding?
Yeah, and The Seventh Seal, which obviously is almost too obvious, really. Yeah. No, I'm afraid I should have thought about it more in advance. I don't know. Have you got any other ideas?
There were a couple I thought of. The main one that kept coming to mind when I watched it was a TV movie I reviewed on the show a couple of years back called Miss Morrison's Ghosts, which is about, Tim, I bet you'll know about this before I explain it, the Moberly-Jordan time slip.
Nope, I'm afraid you've passed me by with that one.
It was the
Remind
one
me.
where those two academic ladies went to France. I think they went to Versailles.
Oh, and one seemed to wander, was it either backwards or forwards in time through the gardens? They encountered people from another century.
They had seen like the court of Louis XVI or whatever it was in front of them. Yes.
Yeah.
And there's an old British TV drama from the very early 80s about that, which is quite easy to find online. And I think that has a similar kind of feeling of the past and the present being very porous. The other thing, there's a very underrated film, which is also Hungarian, so I wonder if there is maybe an influence here, I don't know. A film by a director called Georgi Palfi called Huckle, which is apparently a sort of Hungarian slang term, a kind of onomatopoeia for hiccup. And it's a murder mystery. It's based loosely on a true case. I will not say what the true case is because it's pretty unique and it will give things away. But its gimmick, if you will, is that it is told equally from the perspective of the village's people and their animals. So you will cut from like a scene of a plot relevant character sat on a bench to just a scene of a frog or a slug underneath the bench in this astonishing close-up wildlife photography. And there is a plot purpose for it that reveals itself eventually, but mostly it just left me with this incredible sense of how little most films explore the world, which is a similar feeling to how I left with Magic Hunter.
Yeah. I mean, that sounds like a good angle. And in Magic Hunter, it's definitely it creates the impression that some parallel is being drawn in a lot of cases between the human behavior and the behavior of these animals. And what exact conclusion you're supposed to draw from that, I don't know, wasn't necessarily clear in every case. So, I mean, yeah, I definitely recommend going into it and trying to kind of seek that out. And like you say, it may take more than one viewing to really figure it out. What was the name of that black and white movie? There was like an adaptation of Don Quixote or something? I'm sure I got it off you.
It sounds plausible.
No, never mind. It eludes me for the moment what it was actually called. Okay.
Was it The Fabulous Baron Munchausen?
Oh, yes, of course that was it.
You're getting Williams mixed up.
Not Don Quixote, a kind of, the sort of off-brand Don Quixote.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe that's closer to the kind of medieval side and the slightly kind of fantastical elements of the storytelling.
They would go well together, though.
But,
Hey, this is Veronica Taylor. And I'm Ash Ketchum. Geek Show, I choose you!
So, if you go over to our website, www.thegeekshow.co.uk, you can find our written reviews. You can also find the Geek Shop. If you want to help us keep making these podcasts, you can donate to our Patreon at www.patreon.com/The Geek Show. We are on Twitter, search for TGS_The Geek Show, and on Facebook, just search for The Geek Show. So if you do go over to thegeekshow.co.uk, you can find written reviews that aren't going to be on this show. You can find Mark Cunliffe talking about Sergio Leone's least celebrated spaghetti western, A Fistful of Dynamite, aka Duck You Sucker. Yes. You can also find Ewan Gledo's review of Woody Allen's first film as screenwriter, What's New, Pussycat? But now we've got our off-the-shelf section, and Tim, I believe you've got something in?
I have. I've been watching Werewolf, which is a Polish movie by the director Adrian Panek. I don't know if I should I immediately say the error I made, which is thinking, well, this is going to be a supernatural werewolf movie. It's going to be a monster movie with literal werewolves in it.
You'd think.
Which is kind of went in semi-expecting that, thinking that based on the trailer, that was the kind of thing it was going to end up as, and it was going to be extremely dark and gory. And And of course, it's actually not it's not a supernatural monster movie of any kind. You could say, well, it is a monster movie, sort of, with dogs, is more or less the answer. The monster is dogs.
Right.
Yeah. It's a movie that's set in the immediate aftermath of World War II. So it's set in Eastern Europe in 1945. And it's essentially based on, the Nazi state having collapsed, and follows a group of children and teenagers who have managed to escape from a Nazi death camp in absolutely, horrifying circumstances. And they effectively kind of wander in the wilderness and hold up in a kind of abandoned, ruined house in the woods.
Yeah.
Like a kind of large manor house. And, come up against a pack of former kind of like Nazi German army attack dogs, which have kind of gone native and are now just roaming around the woods extremely hungry. And so it's a sort of under siege kind of scenario where they're holed up in this house, surrounded by the dogs with no way of getting out, and the dogs having become, extremely vicious killers. So in a way, it's not far off in a sense of being something like a sort of werewolf zombie film. There's some pretty unpleasant gore that happens in it. There are people get their throats torn out and stuff like that, and you get people suffering, horrible injuries.
Yeah.
But you could call it partly a horror film, partly a sort of drama, just because of the kind of historicity of its setting.
Yeah.
I think I vaguely recall seeing it sort of referred to as a black comedy somewhere online, or like a kind of darkly comic kind of drama horror. And I thought, wow, that's a very generous definition of comedy, if that's...
Yes.
Yeah, I think you'd have trouble getting any laughs out of it from me, to tell you the truth. But it's... the funny thing about it is although it sounds like obviously an extremely evocative and kind of overpowering historical setting where you can't escape from the fact that this is set in the immediate aftermath of the Holocaust, and it's got the political backdrop of it is absolutely horrifying, and the kids spend most of the movie dressed in, camp uniforms, kind of like striped prisoner uniforms.
Right.
From a Nazi death camp. And it's like, well, that's something pretty difficult to ignore, but in a funny sort of way, that setting, it's not really much of a kind of historical commentary. It's more symbolic than that. And the setting that it's set in, which is a kind of house in the middle of this vast expanse of woodland, somewhere in sort of rural Poland, is quite sort of separated from the outside world, really. And it just focuses entirely on these kids.
Yeah.
And it's a very, very striking sort of setting, because they've got this amazing bit of wilderness. They've got throughout the film aerial shots of the kind of roads that weave through these huge kind of evergreen forests, and the kind of hills with sort of mist pouring off them, and sort of rocky cliffs. And the house that they find is sort of kind of slightly ruined, like an abandoned, I don't know, kind of manor house or very, very large luxury home that's kind of become, everything's rusty and it's covered with ivy.
Yeah.
And it does create this strange situation of the characters being sort of adrift in this wilderness where there's no real glimpse of the outside world exactly. I mean, the very first opening scenes, they're still in the Nazi camp, but then they escape from it, or they're just kind of left to wander out, really, when Russian troops arrive. And so it follows, I think there's about half a dozen or 8 kids who, again, kind of live in this horrifying situation. There's only a couple of adult characters. There's a couple of Soviet soldiers, and there's a kind of older woman who who ends up acting as a sort of, accidental kind of head of the orphanage by being in this house and trying to find food for the kids for a bit.
Yeah.
But this is before they realise just how much trouble they're in with the fact that this pack of dogs is roaming the woods. And the funny thing about it is it could have been made as a more traditional kind of horror movie, or something could have been made more gothic or evil about these dogs than actually is done. And they kind of become this sort of, I don't know if you could say natural force exactly, but they're not kind of directed in a sort of sensational kind of slasher movie way.
Yeah, it's not White Dog.
Yeah. It is a pretty suspenseful movie in a way that it's mainly for the 2 reasons you kind of think from quite early on, you realise, well, it's not the type of movie that's worried about just like killing off any character at a moment's notice,
Yeah.
So a character can suddenly suffer a kind of gory death. In fact, in some cases, they can sort of wander out of shot, and then later on their mutilated body can be found.
Yeah.
Although, again, it's the kind of thing where they pretty successfully set up that kind of thing. Although they don't use that as much as sensationally, thankfully, as they could have done. But the other thing, of course, is it's got the brilliant device for a jump scare, which is just a extremely loud barking dog suddenly leaps into view.
Yeah,
which is a very effective jump scare, and I don't know. I hope it works on some of you lot in the same way that it worked on me, because it scared the hell out of me a couple of times that it happened. But they end up almost in this kind of peculiar situation where they have to kind of figure out a way of getting out of this house. Now they've locked themselves in, they've shut all the doors and windows, and they're sort of, locked up the dumbwaiter and the coal chute and things like that. But the house is surrounded by these completely mad, starving dogs.
Yeah.
And it comes across as quite a kind of symbolic story. There's a couple of different things you could do to interpret it, I suppose. I kind of went into it thinking for the first half of it that the characters mostly weren't going to get names and you weren't going to get much individual development for the kids. There's some kids very young. There's a little girl who's completely mute, implied to have seen unbelievable horrors, which, certainly she has. And then there's a couple of teenagers who are trying to act a bit more like adults, and there's some kind of 8-year-olds and 10-year-olds. And you kind of gradually get the characteristics of them, but also they start off, early on in the film, they compare the camp numbers that have been tattooed on their arms.
Yeah.
And it's sort of like, well, there's a kind of, intentional sort of obliteration of their identity there, which is, someone gets asked their name and they just give their number as a response.
Yes.
Some of the kids don't have names. And there's one kid who's a German rather than being, Polish.
Mm.
And it just kind of identifies himself. It just says, they just call me the dirty German.
Yeah.
He's disliked and distrusted by the other kids for being German.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of kind of very grim incidental stuff which you expect for a movie that is kind of on the sort of peripherals of the Holocaust as a setting. So there's characters who've kind of slashed their wrists or bitten their wrists, possibly even drunk their own blood and that kind of thing.
Mm.
And more or less, I think that the theme of it that I kind of detected is sort of to do with the sort of parallels between, there's some sort of natural force with these dogs, and the kids themselves are practically kind of regressing to the same level, which is that they find, scraps of food, and they're so desperately hungry and thirsty, they end up kind of fighting with each other and sort of tearing at scraps of food with their hands and that kind of thing, and even just getting into fights, fist fights with each other. And then some of the kids, the older ones, are trying to force them to stay civilized and to kind of get them dressed up and actually eating with utensils and that kind of thing. So at the same time, it doesn't, like I said, it doesn't really portray the dogs as being completely evil. In a way, there's even bits where the dogs in a way are quite sort of cute, which is that someone tries to give commands to the dogs and the dog is sort of cocking its head trying to understand what's being said to it.
Right.
Even though it seems to be in the habit, of just attacking humans, just jumping straight for the throat. And they're dogs that have been trained by the German army as attack dogs, or so the implication is. But obviously, the movie's called Werewolf, and I don't know if you're aware of this kind of element of Nazi propaganda from the end of World War II, which is the supposed idea of the werewolf unit or the werewolf squad being the kind of undercover Nazi,
the left
military,
behind,
kind of SS covert unit, which wore the same uniform as the enemy and was sort of infiltrate and then attack. And this line is brought up more or less in the movie, where the little kid saying, "Is it true that the SS have all turned into dogs?" And that's kind of what they believe, that, Nazi troops have just become savage attack dogs. The kids need to get, various kind of animal characteristics that are sort of true of the dogs it also end up true of the kids, and they sort of struggle with this. And the kids, eat dog food, and they need to get treated for lice and stuff like that, and they need to kind of pour kerosene on their hair and that kind of thing. So the idea of werewolf, well, it's partly there of just thinking the Nazis have turned into savage wolves, but also the kids themselves are kind of switching sides that way, and their own sort of just feral natures of just regressing are sort of part of it as well.
So we've programmed an unintentional double bill of Eastern European films about the links between human and animal behaviour, right?
Yeah, yes. But it's kind of got this ruined kind of house they inhabit as the element of civilization. They're in that and trying to dress themselves up in other clothes and trying to eat food with utensils as this kind of island of civilization in the middle of this terrible wilderness. And it works, to my view, extremely well in this way. I don't know if it necessarily be everyone just because of how grim what happens in it is. But then the funny thing is, you would expect for a kind of like besieged horror movie, you'd think, well, the characters are going to get killed off one by one, and then one of them will stumble out of the woods at the end alive. But that's not exactly what happens. I don't know if I want to give away too much of it, but there is a slight sort of barrier, the barrier between the dogs and the humans kind of gets eroded away to the point where there's one person who manages to sort of switch sides and kind of befriends the dogs almost.
Right.
And it kind of ends, it proceeds very strangely in that way. There's Soviet soldiers who are just brutally attacking the dogs or being attacked by the dogs and getting killed by them. But the kids themselves, despite, they make some efforts to sort of fight back against these dogs, but it's just not really a movie that's kind of solved by violence. If anything, it's dealt with by other kind of unusual means about the animals' behaviour and the kids' behaviour. Well, you have to watch it and see. There are things in it that are quite, I wouldn't say exactly surprising, but maybe unusual. And obviously from the trailer of this, it was sold as much more of a kind of horror slasher kind of scenario. And actually there's a lot more about it that's quite kind of thoughtful. And you realise at the end that it's got this kind of symbolism about the kids', identity and things like that was completely taken away from them at the start and just numbers stamped on them. And they kind of gradually get a bit of it back. I mean, some pretty horrible other stuff happens as well, but... And the other humans in the story, like the soldiers they expect are going to sort of bring civilization, but definitely don't. And
yes, yeah.
And it's got an absolutely cracking set of young actors. I mean, it almost goes without saying, really. To carry this off, there's, the quite distinctive kind of characters. This mute little girl who's, obviously just totally emotionless, really. I mean, not even reacting with kind of visible fear to some of the stuff where she gets like pursued by a pack of attack dogs. The point where she kind of gets herself away, and there's, the kid who seems to take the kind of folkloric sort of supernatural line of saying these things are werewolves and talking about kind of strange kind of curses and things that might have fallen on people. There's a very kind of isolated kid with glasses who just called Vladik, who just goes kind of watches everything that's happening. So he just kind of stares, and he pretty much only interacts with the story. I mean, I wasn't sure what was meant by this, that he pretty much only opens and closes doors and windows. That's all he does, really. And it makes huge differences in certain cases. It's sort of like, well, you've opened a door or a shutter, you've closed a window, or you've looked through a window. And this seems to drive, a lot of this drives the story forward in this situation where they're holed up in this house. But yeah, I mean...
Yeah, is that like a reaction to having been imprisoned? Is that why it is?
Yeah, I think there's an element of that in it, yes. I mean, again, I kind of want to avoid giving away what happens because, like I say, there's a slightly sort of permeable barrier between the dogs and the humans, and it's possible for people to kind of switch sides, and the dogs can become friendly and the humans can sort of turn feral, and there's a bit of both does actually happen. Yeah. So... like I say, it's got an extremely, an absolutely cracking set of, young actors playing the kids. And there are some adults, but the adults get it even worse than the kids do, to be honest.
Yeah.
There's also an absolutely cracking set of actors playing the dogs, in the sense that the dogs are obviously a supremely trained sort of pack that pulls off some amazing stunts. And to tell you the truth, the dogs must have had huge fun filming it, and it probably overall was quite good fun filming for that reason, which is the dogs probably thought the whole thing was a right laugh. They were getting to do crazy stuff like jumping on trucks and through windows, climbing up, coal chutes and that kind of thing, and jumping on people and knocking them over. As far as the dogs were concerned, they probably just had a nice kind of holiday in the countryside, mucking around with a load of teenagers. Yeah.
So that's out on Montage Pictures, I believe.
Yep, it's called Werewolf in English. I suppose you could say Werewolf. Possibly you should pronounce it. Werewolf. It seems to have been called slightly different things in other languages. I think it's been called the Survivors or sort of the Escapees in some languages.
Nah, Werewolf's better.
Yeah, Werewolf is definitely the right title, and it reflects, like I say, the fact that you can kind of you can change from human into beast a bit in the film. To an extent, and that's the reason that title was picked, and it is a terrific title.
And so this is a review of the Golem. I won't try and pronounce the German subtitle, which is basically means and how he came to be in the world. And this is a bit of an odd fish in terms of its derivation. Effectively, this is Paul Wegener and Carl Boes's third Golem movie and acts as a prequel to the previous two. Unfortunately, the two films that it's a prequel to no longer exist, not even in negative form, so sadly we'll almost certainly never see the light of day. So what we've got here is in fact a 1920 film that works perfectly well as a standalone. Because it's a prequel, it explains all the mythos that is needed to understand the Golem without doing a sort of Bruce Wayne style retelling of a story that we've seen several times before. And it's astonishing watching this film just how easy it is to spot how it's influenced future filmmakers. But first, the elephant in the room, the Golem's hair. The Golem's hair looks awful. However, it does successfully look like it's made of clay, which is the important point. And actually, given the limitations of 1920 technology, the Golem itself is generally pretty well executed. You know, you've got to remember there was no Stan Winston or Rick Baker around to call upon. And so, from that perspective, it's actually quite impressive. It looks like it's made of earth. It doesn't work so well in close-up, apart from the hair, which looks like a sort of proto-Beatles bowl cut. You've also got the fact that Paul Wegener himself dons the Golem costume, as he did in the two previous films, and could win a competition for gurning, it has to be said. These are tiny, tiny flaws, because what we have here over the 86 minutes running time, or 60 minutes if you watch the US version, is an incredibly influential film. I mean, you've got to remember that this predates the Universal Monsters franchise. It's possible that this is, in fact, part of the first ever movie franchise. Unfortunately, we'll never get to see the rest of it. The 4K restoration is superb, considering that they were struggling with two sets of negatives. And there is, on the Blu-ray release, an extra that does a comparison of this against the DVD remaster that was done only sort of 14, 15 years ago. And the difference in quality is stupendous. You've also got an option to watch this with three very different, unique, all equally valid scores, which really do give a different take on your appreciation of the film. You've got one by composer Stephen Horn, electronic music producer Wudek, and the musician and film score composer Admir Shkirted. There's also the US version of the film is included, which has also been fully restored, and that features a score by Cordula Heth. What gets me with this is the fact that it has so much intricate filmmaking technique in there that I can see direct influences on things like James Whale's Frankenstein from 1931. There are also definite shades of that organic horror that permeates things like Alien and Geiger's designs for Alien. The story is one that quite clearly focuses on the oppression of Jewish people in Germany, because that's where it came from. But what they've done here is they've taken the mythology of the Golem and they've told the story of the first Golem, if you like. We translate the action from Germany, which was the focus of the first two films, to 16th century Prague, where Rabbi Lowe, played by Albert Steinruck, creates a forbidding clay golem to protect his people from the tyrannical emperor Luwa, who's played here by Otto Gebauer. Now, Luwa is your typical sort of decadent, corrupt, and pompous emperor, with that double standard of he protects his power using the power of prophecy by exhibited by the astrologer, who is a member of the Jewish community. The Jewish community is ghettoized, but whenever it seems like the Jews are getting some kind of power, the emperor suddenly decrees that the astrologer is actually practicing black magic, and as a result, the ghettoized Jews are hereby expelled. And it's this that prompts Rabbi Lowe to bring to life the demon spirit controlled by an amulet that allows this indestructible earth power to strike out against the enemies of the Jewish people. However, not only is it a tale of power and revenge and almost a parallel for a superhero movie, but it's also a morality tale, because the rabbi's assistant attempts to control the golem for his own gains. In this case, it's to stop the rabbi's daughter from falling in love with the emperor's messenger. But because of this corrupts the golem's activity, and it goes on a rampage of anger and destructive force, and leaves fire and death in its wake throughout the ghetto it's supposed to be protecting. The set design is astonishingly organic. It gives a real sense of a city hewn from living rock, which of course accentuates the nature of the golem itself. The buildings lean towards each other conspiratorially, as if chattering about the rumours of black magic, and really instilling a sort of claustrophobic nature, which, with the ghettoized Jewish community under threat, really sort of adds to the claustrophobic feel. The effects for the time are stunning. It's quite frankly one of the finest examples of Weimar cinema I've ever seen. Granted, I haven't seen a lot, but I've seen 3 or 4 films over the past few years. This has got to be one of my favourites, and it's a crying shame actually that the other 2 films are indeed lost. If you get the opportunity to get hold of a copy of Der Golem, then I would highly recommend it. Forgive the hair, forgive the slightly dodgy gurning. They're minor points. This is filmmaking at its very best. So that's Der Golem, a new 4K restoration on Eureka Masters of Cinema.
Right, so coming out on Thursday the 12th December, we've got a remake of the old Bob Clark, was it Bob Clark? I think it was, a slasher film Black Christmas, directed by Sophia Takal, who did a lot of those, I thought, fairly tedious kind of early 2010s horror where it's all semi-improvised and they've got mumblecore people in, but let's not hold that against someone. And that's got Imogen Poots from Green Room in. On Friday the 13th, we've got Citizen K, Alex Gibney's new documentary about the anti-Putin Russian oligarch Mikhail Khodorkovsky. We have a follow-up to a reboot that I think we were all dreading last year, but the people who've seen it have said it is actually very enjoyable. It's Jumanji: The Next Level.
Wow, okay. Yeah, which is the kind of thing where you might expect it's actually got quite a lot of good fun in it, despite how completely absurd and silly the whole thing is.
I think, yeah, that's been the general consensus on it. And this one has Danny Glover and Danny DeVito in, so yeah, it's got that going for it.
I mean, it seems like it's almost kind of eaten its own tail, this, really. It's like, well, you know, they've escalated the Jumanji, which I think was originally like a board game or something.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's now escalated to the point where it's like a video game that's a full CG virtual reality simulation.
Yes, yeah.
So it's kind of like, well, does that almost defeat the point, really. You could just make the actual video game, but again, nevertheless, people say these seem to be quite good fun, so...
Next step, geocaching. That'll be what the next Jumanji movie's about.
Yes.
We have Pink Wall, an indie drama by Tom Cullen, which I mention largely because it has Tatiana Maslany in it, and I'm nothing if not predictable.
Yeah.
We have the dystopian drama Sons of Denmark by Ulla Salim.
What's that about? That sounds good.
Apparently it's in near future Copenhagen. There's been a terrorist atrocity, radicalization going on, that sort of business, that kind of dystopia.
Yeah, well, that sounds like right up our street, really. I think I'll watch that.
And we've got Kingmaker, the new documentary from wealth chronicler Lauren Greenfield, this time taking aim at one of the 20th century's icons of conspicuous consumption. Why is that so hard to say? Imelda Marcos.
Consumptuous conspiction. No.
Thank you for your support.
Yeah, that's what I'm here for, just...
But yes, listeners, next week we are going to our Christmas minisodes, which include best and worst of the year, alternative Christmas movies, and other such end-of-year fun. So I'll just give you a quick roundup on what's out for the rest of December. Thursday, 19th of December, small indie, don't know much about it, Star Wars The Rise of Skywalker.
Oh, yes, yeah.
Which, I mean, I've mentioned before that I have no real interest in Star Wars, but this one does have Richard E. Grant in, so it's got that going for it.
Who's it got Richard E. Grant in? Is he playing a Jedi?
I've got no idea who he's playing. I hope it's with Neil.
Is he? Yeah. Is he possibly just going to be effectively doing a voice in some CGI motion captured alien?
Oh, it seems depressingly likely, doesn't it?
Yeah. Well, I don't know.
Hey, speaking of doing a voice for CG motion captured things, 20th of December, Friday, Cats.
Oh, good God. No, we're not... Yeah. We're not going to cover that, are we? It looks absolutely horrifying. Stop cackling, it does. It's not funny.
It does, and it brings me legitimate glee that something has been released into the world looking like that.
It looks like some sort of... It's almost got like a kind of weird recreation of slightly David Cronenberg sort of body horror where someone's face has been stretched over something.
Judi Dench as the ruler cat who wears the peeled off skins of her fallen brethren.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I'm going to have to be made quite drunk and paid quite a lot of money in order to watch this, I think.
Finally, on 26th of December, there's some fairly dull-looking kids' films, but also a very promising-looking family film. Greta Gerwig's follow-up to Lady Bird, which is her adaptation of Louisa May Alcott's Little Women. It stars Saoirse Ronan, Eliza Scanlon, Florence Pugh, and Emma Watson as Little Women, Meryl Streep as regular-sized woman, Laura Dern as 20% extra-free woman, and Timothy Chalamet, who is not a woman.
Right.
The long pause was merited.
Hello, sorry. I really have no comment to make there.
It's fine.
Yeah. Don't Yeah, but so yes. All right. Let's not specify the size of the women in every subsequent film, though. I mean, it's
no.
If anything, Little Women is the film where you don't need to specify it, really. The title gives it away. You could have just left that one as it is and instead specified the size of the women and men in all other films.
Yeah, that's a fair point, and maybe in 2020 we'll start doing that.
Yes, and then immediately stop doing it.
Can't imagine anyone objecting. But we're going to come back on regular podcast duty in January when Taika Waititi's Jojo Rabbit will be our first film of the week. But before then, as I say, we do have Christmas mini-sodes, so look out for them coming out across the Christmas and New Year period. But until then, that's been your lot from Cinema Eclectica. I've been Graham.
And I've been Tim.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next year.